Hi everyone, and welcome to week 9 of the course. This week we'll be looking at sustainability and the natural environment. The next 4 weeks use a framework that is relatively common when looking at sustainability in terms of the 4 sectors of activity that an organisation typically focuses on. The first is this week's, which, as I said, is the natural environment. Then we'll be looking at the marketplace, so how sustainability materializes in the marketplace by way of products and marketing. And there are lots of examples of that in terms of the car industry, the food industry, the hospitality industry, the airline industry, etc., etc. So we'll be considering some of those. Excuse me, got a horrible cold this morning. And then we'll be looking at sustainability in the workplace. So how sustainability impacts upon people, sustainable employment practices. And then finally, we'll be looking at sustainability in the community. So how sustainability materializes from a community perspective, looking at how organizations engage with community investment strategies. And we'll be looking at some very current and innovative approaches to community investment and engagement. Okay, so look, this week, sustainability in the natural environment. We'll be looking at a few key areas. So learning objectives this week are looking at carbon and carbon emissions, looking at how businesses can understand their environmental impacts and carbon footprinting. Also, how businesses can reduce their environmental impacts. We'll be taking a glance at climate management and climate change. We'll be touching upon some broader environmental issues and environmental management systems. We'll be considering the implications of climate change for business, and we'll also be touching upon issues of biodiversity. And look, in this 9th week, we have already touched upon many of these issues. We saw the KPMG report a few weeks ago, looking at these mega forces that are going to shape business and society over the next 10, 20 or 30 years. That same report touched upon issues of biodiversity. Rates of extinction of animals have never been higher, and so there is clearly something happening in the natural environment. So many of these things we've touched upon already, but we'll go into them in a little bit more detail this week. Moscato, our trusted textbook, again, 2 chapters this week, straddling carbon and natural environment, chapters 6 and 13, both a good read. I've given you also an article from the Sustainability Matters Australian newsletter on sustainability, looking at corporate sustainability, which I hope you find useful. I've also given you an article from the US, from GreenBiz, which is a pretty good newsletter from over there, talking about climate leadership and the Carbon Disclosure Project. That's a global project to assess how organizations disclose their carbon interests and what they're doing to mitigate those interests. And then finally, an article from Canada on biodiversity and how business is partnering with NGOs to look at issues of biodiversity. All right, so look, our Watch and Reflect this week is a recent broadcast entitled The Costs of Carbon, Australia 24 Hours of Reality. And it was a global broadcast, a partnership of primarily NGOs who wanted to raise the issue of increasing levels of carbon in the atmosphere. And so there was an Australian broadcast for an hour that was very illuminating, and again, obviously, not particularly balanced in its approach. Clearly out to get a message across, but I'd like you to consider that message and its validity and indeed veracity. The video also provokes thinking around what's currently happening here in Australia with government policy around carbon. We've seen the kerfuffle or shambles around the carbon tax over the last few years, and prior to that, the John Howard initiated emissions trading scheme, which never really got off the ground, and now we're going down a route of direct action. So I'd like you to consider the pros and cons of those three approaches. There is some coverage in the textbook, and for you to start thinking about which is the most appropriate for Australia and indeed for the global economic community. Our case study this week looks at Yalumba Wines, again a winery close to home, and we look at how they have integrated sustainability into their value proposition, the work that they've done on their carbon footprint, and looking back at life cycle assessments, something we covered a few weeks ago in Sustainable Business Models. Our weekly discussion forum gives you a chance just to look at 4 key issues touching upon the environment, greenhouse gases, the carbon cycle, the ozone layer, and carbon footprinting. And that's from the EPA site in Victoria. And there's a bit of a discussion there asking you to think about those and to consider your own environmental impacts and how you can better mitigate and manage those. So this week, in summary, is a whistle-stop tour of sustainability and the environment, some core pillars to facilitate your understanding in the environmental space. Feel free to read more widely. Clearly, environment is the primary focus typically of companies when building a sustainability strategy. There's a strong focus on environmental impacts, and it's a very tangible thing that companies can get their arms around and indeed their heads around. So please enjoy the week, immerse yourself in the readings, and also maybe think about the organisation that you work for, who are most familiar with what they're doing to manage their environmental impacts, and perhaps some of the things that you've seen as part of that environmental management program. Okay guys, thanks for your attention, and as I said, enjoy the week, and please shout if you have any questions. Cheers.